Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining the latest EuroCham webinar titled On the Road to Recovery, Cambodia's Economic Outlook for 2021. This is the latest in our webinar series where we aim to tackle issues relevant to the COVID-19 pandemic, and perhaps there is no greater issue to tackle than just how COVID-19 has affected Cambodia and when we might expect to see a recovery. For all of those listening, I would like to thank the European Commission, as well as our EuroCham 2020 sponsors, without whose support this event would not be possible. With the news over the weekend of the first cases of community transmission in Cambodia, today's topic is particularly relevant, and I'm pleased and honoured to be joined by representatives of the ADB in Cambodia who will describe their latest economic analysis. Today's webinar will have a three-part structure, and it will last just around 1 hour and 15 minutes. The session will be divided into a brief introduction, the main presentation, and an audience Q&A where the speakers will have the chance to address your questions. If you have a question at any point, please type it in the chat window in the bottom right of your corner. We will either address it during the flow of the presentation, or it will be addressed in the Q&A session at the end. Due to the number of participants, however, it's unlikely that we'll be able to address all questions. If you can address one audience a question ahead of time, the slides will be available. The slides and the footer will be posted on our EuroCham YouTube channel. And for everybody registered today, you will also be sent a personal email with the link once it's ready. To introduce myself, my name is Tom Hesketh, and I'm the Business Services Manager at EuroCham Cambodia. Today, I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. But today, I really have the pleasure of being joined by three members of the ADB Cambodia team who will introduce themselves at the start of their presentation. But we have Ms. Sunia Dorani Jamal, the Country Director of the ADB. We have Mr. David Friedman, the Country Economist at the ADB. And we also have Mr. Pulon Dong, the Senior Economics Officer of the ADB. So before we start, just to find out what EuroCham itself has been up to over the past 6 months, you can find our latest newsletter on the EuroCham website and probably in your inboxes already. We're continuing to analyse new government announcements. We then disseminate them to our members. We were planning on holding a PowerPoint training. We were planning on holding a breakfast talk on labour compliance. And we were also planning on holding a talk on how European brands can meet their renewable energy targets in Cambodia. However, as just one very minor impact of COVID-19, all of these events will now be postponed until 2021. And that's to address the latest announcement and the latest measures to combat the 28th of November event, preventing gatherings of over 20 people. We do still hope to have our annual Tool Buildings Forum on the 14th of January. That may be optimistic, but it's still our hope. And earlier in the year, we were also able to launch a new website called Invest in Cambodia, which I would encourage you to visit for a broad overview on the economic statistics and the sectors of opportunity still present in the kingdom. However, on a far more serious note, and to transition to the content you came for, COVID-19 has had a vast impact on Cambodia's economy. Cambodia has experienced its first contraction in GDP since the year 2000. In particular, it's hit key sectors such as tourism, manufacturing, and construction. Cambodia's tourism sector has experienced a 78% drop in passenger traffic compared to 2019. And as just one example of its impact on employment, the Ministry of Labour very recently confirmed that over 110 garment factories have closed, leaving over 55,000 workers unemployed. And certainly not all of the garment factory workers who have been furloughed. So all in all, ADB data placed Cambodia's GDP as shrinking 4% in 2020. But the hope was still that it would recover in 2021. And with that said, I'm now very excited to learn from the ADB team themselves to see in more detail how realistic these predictions will be. So Sunia and the ADB team, I now pass the floor to yourself and you.
Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm very, very pleased to be here with my team, with David and with Pulan, to present our economic outlook for the near term. And just before starting, I was having a look at the invitee list, and I'm very happy to see that we have such a range of attendees from private companies, garment factories, embassies, NGOs, and of course the public sector as well as journalists. So I welcome you all, and I think I'm very happy, even as a member of the EuroCham, to get a lot of very, very helpful information. So we're also looking forward to your events in 2021. I'd just like to start, I think, with a brief introduction on the ADB. Just wait for the slides to load. So as many of you may know that the Asian Development Bank was established in 1966, and Cambodia has been a member of the ADB since that time. We established an office in Cambodia in 1996, so it's been a very long-running partnership. In terms of our overall lending to the region, we committed about $22.2 billion in 2019. And in terms of our lending to Cambodia, we are the second largest creditor to the government, China or PRC being the largest. In 2019, ADB developed a 5-year country partnership strategy. I won't go into the details here, but suffice to say that our areas of intervention are aligned with the government's rectangular strategy. And quite essentially, I think we called, intentionally, we called our strategy Inclusive Pathways to a Competitive Economy. And I think that highlights our corporate view that bringing people along and building skills and human capital is very essential to sustainable growth in any economy or in any society. So with that, I think I'm going to pass over to my colleague, David, for an overview of the economic outlook. And towards the end, I'd be very happy to take any questions on our strategy, policy, or any other corporate aspects that you may have. Thank you. Over to you, David.
Great. Thank you, Sunir. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for joining us for the presentation, the webinar. For those of you who are in Cambodia or based here, I hope we will have the chance to meet in person, perhaps after the latest issues with the pandemic have died down. And for those of you, if you're joining from outside Cambodia, then very much hope that you'll be able to visit soon and also perhaps to invest or to start your business here. From ADB, we monitor the economy quite closely, and we produce projections, sort of medium term, 2 years out. We update these on an almost quarterly basis, and there's quite a lot of detail that's published. For today's presentation, we made a decision not to sort of fixate on the very latest indicators and so on, but actually just to step out a little bit and reflect. The pandemic is a big disruption, and in some senses, there's a question of whether the next few years, to what extent we will be on the same trends that we were on previously. Will things be different? If so, how? And so rather than really looking into the minutiae of each indicator or variable, we decided to take a slightly bigger picture view. So I hope that this is relevant to your interests. But if you have any questions at all, please, you can ask afterwards, and we'll do our best to answer. And then happy to also have more discussion offline if that's appropriate. So the first thing in thinking about Cambodia's outlook and Cambodia's prospects, I think we need to keep in mind that it is very much part of a region, and a region that's quite dynamic, quite large. So Cambodia, we might often think of Cambodia as being a small country or a small economy, but the 16.5 million people in Cambodia are part of a population in the surrounding Mekong Sub-Region that's close to 250 million, with a GDP that's close to $1 trillion, and very, very integrated with the neighboring countries, but also with the wider economy in Asia Pacific and beyond. So you can see that Cambodia's total trade is maybe $46 billion last year, and that's against about 1.3 trillion for the GMS as a whole. So I think important to keep this in mind, and also to bear in mind that there's an ongoing process of integration of this region driven by infrastructure investments. You can see some of the transport corridors on the map, but also in some of the soft and sort of policy integration, on trade facilitation and other cross-border cooperation. Looking at Cambodia's recent performance, we can see that Cambodia, from the Paris Peace Agreement onwards, it's been one of the fastest growing countries in the world, but starting from such a low base. And so, as countries get richer, it is natural that their rate of growth slows down. So far, Cambodia has really been one sort of highly performing and much above trend. And of course, we hope that it will resume that growth path, and we do see it as possible. But in order to assess the likelihood, we need to think about what were the drivers in the past and how that may change in the future. Even with all of the growth that Cambodia has had over the last 25 years, there's still a huge potential for convergence within the immediate neighborhood. So here you can see in this chart GDP per capita, just in US dollar terms. Cambodia is the dark blue line. And you can see that certainly a huge gap from Thailand as a neighboring country, but also Vietnam and Laos significantly higher. So, of course, each economy is a bit different, but with the integration and proximity, there is good potential for convergence. Overall, we would say that Cambodia has done quite remarkably well in managing the pandemic. We're all now very aware of the cases that have popped up and the community transmission, and hoping that the swift action the government has taken will bring it under control quickly. But we've also seen, I think, in addition to the health response and careful control of borders, we've also seen very proactive use of fiscal policy. So, an overall stimulus package at around 3% of GDP, some resources for health measures, but also a lot of spending and investment in social protection and economic stimulus. And I think this speaks to, in some ways, the pragmatism of government and also its readiness to intervene where it sees a need. And that's encouraging as we look ahead. If we think about the medium-term outlook, there are various things which I think give us some grounds for optimism. And one of them is the very young population and also quite dynamic economy. You can see here the population pyramid based on the 2009 census. Actually, the 2019 census has been completed, but some of the age-based data has not yet been released. But this population structure, we have a very young population that is in the process of upgrading its skills and entering the workforce. And what we see alongside that is that Cambodia has been upgrading its exports and its productive capacity within the economy. I think this will be a key part of future growth. And looking at demographics is it's a very favorable context overall. The previous growth story has also been very much built on openness to trade. And so you can see the chart on the left-hand side, the bars showing you trade as a share of GDP, and then the red line showing you the value of trade. It's also, I think, notable if you look at Cambodia's performance in certain measures, related to trade performance. So compared to the regional averages, it performs well and it's improving. So that you see that in terms of days to clear exports, days to clear imports, and then also the proportion of firms who are identifying trade regulations as a real constraint on their own operations. I'm sure it's not perfect, so perhaps there are businesses here that have their own frustrations. But if we look within the regional context, it's performing well and also improving quite rapidly. It's also been, I think Cambodia has been an outlier or has stood out in terms of its openness to investment and how much foreign direct investment it has been receiving. You can see Cambodia in the bar chart on the left-hand side is the blue bars, and that's the percentage of FDI. FDI is a percentage of GDP compared to the average for the GMS countries. So quite large inflows, and that's supported by a very open policy framework. So on the right-hand side, you can see the OECD's FDI restrictiveness index, and Cambodia is a red bar. You can see globally it's very open. And pretty open compared to almost all of the countries in ASEAN and also in Asia, which are rated by OECD. So that welcoming environment, part of, I think, a pragmatic approach to developing the economy, which has certainly been delivering results up to now. At the same time, I think there's a recognition that a new phase of reform will be needed in order to sustain growth rates that we saw up to 2020 with the pandemic. One of the interesting trends is looking at economic performance is that while the headline growth rate has remained quite stable, around 7%, the composition of growth has changed over time. So, around the last financial crisis, the agriculture sector was performing quite strongly. But since then, agriculture has, at least in terms of value added in total, it's sort of stabilized, if not stagnated. And what we've seen coming out of that is actually quite a boom in construction and real estate. And of course, people who are here in Cambodia or in Phnom Penh will be very aware of that. There's an issue. I mean, that's obviously responding to needs and investment opportunities, and that's where the growth is coming. But this is not necessarily a sector that can be where growth can be sustained indefinitely. So some issues around maybe the quality of growth or the sustainability, and a need to look ahead and think about what are the reforms and other actions that will be needed to enable a next phase of growth. Part of that story is that wages have been rising, and we may in the past have been used to thinking of Cambodia as a very low wage, low skill, low cost environment. But certainly the minimum wages have been increasing quite steadily. And now even with a below inflation increase in the minimum wage for garment workers this year, minimum wages are almost double what they are in Myanmar or in Bangladesh, which are two of the commonly cited alternatives for the very low cost, low value added garment manufacturing. So this increase in wages, I think, is a positive. It corresponds to improved productivity and also better incomes for households. But it is a change, and it's perhaps is undermining the competitiveness of the very, very low cost manufacturing. We've also seen another change in terms of context is some changes in market access. Cambodia has been receiving tariff-free and quota-free access to the advanced economy markets by virtue of being a least developed country, an LDC, through the UN classification. I think many of you, I'm sure, will be aware that the European Union made a decision to partially withdraw that access at the beginning of 2020, and that withdrawal has now come into effect, covering items that corresponded to around 20% of Cambodia's exports to the European Union. There's also been some discussion within the US around trade preferences to Cambodia. It seems to be less of an immediate issue, but certainly a possibility. In the meantime, some of Cambodia's competitors, including, for example, Vietnam, have enhanced their access to key markets. So for Cambodia, at the same time that it has been losing some trade preferences, Vietnam has also secured the free trade agreement with the European Union. So the overall context is changing. And looking ahead, we can see the possibility, or we can anticipate the eventual graduation from the LDC status, which would then mean the loss of trade preferences. So you can see the three different criteria that are used for classification of LDCs. Cambodia is close to passing the threshold for graduation on income, and has already passed the thresholds for human assets and economic vulnerability. So yes, it won't happen immediately, but it lies ahead, and it is certainly anticipated and part of the government's planning in terms of trade policy. There's also, I think, been a growing recognition of the need to improve competitiveness in a broad sense. You can see in this chart a comparison of the assessments made by the World Economic Forum. They consider 12 different dimensions, and they drill into a lot of detail in terms of different elements. What you can see is that in some areas, Cambodia is, basically at the regional average, either for the GMS or for ASEAN as a whole. For example, on labor market efficiency, also goods market efficiency is quite close. But in other areas, including infrastructure, including institutions, also including higher education and training, there's significant gaps. I think the government is well aware of this. And if you look at policy reform, what's coming ahead, and also investments, you can see that the priority is being given to areas where there is a significant gap. So I think it's encouraging, but also we need to be realistic about the time that's required. Looking ahead, we've identified what we would see as 5 fundamental drivers of sustained growth, which will be relevant in the years ahead. The first is the steady pace of reforms. Overall, we tend to see within the context of an overall strategy, the rectangular strategy, there's ongoing efforts to address constraints in a range of areas that relates, for example, to infrastructure, trade policy, education, skills development, the business enabling environment. And so I think with implementation of those reforms, we can hope and expect to see a steady improvement in the quality of the enabling environment for private sector activity, and that will help to stimulate further growth. The second key area that we identify is on improvements in infrastructure and also in logistics. There's some very large projects which are underway and which will be completed in the years ahead, and which will have, I think, significant impacts on the overall quality of transport connectivity, of infrastructure, with then implications for private sector activity. That includes the upgrading of the port in Sihanoukville, the Sihanoukville Phnom Penh Expressway, airport upgrades, energy infrastructure upgrades, and so on. So there's a lot in the pipeline, and I think the government remains committed to that and has fiscal space to step up its investment in the years ahead. The third major trend is digitization and innovation. Again, I think some people may be used to thinking of Cambodia, especially if they're not based here, thinking of Cambodia as being relatively low tech or sort of low skilled, but we actually see quite a lot of momentum in digitization, e-commerce, and the sort of digital economy, and also a strong push to accelerate that. On the public sector side, the government with its Cambodia Data Exchange is very forward-thinking and forward-looking in terms of its reforms. And then we see also on the private sector side, lots of innovation and local development of different applications. The fourth of the 5 trends that we identify is the shifts in regional value chains and also market access. This is partially related to the changes in trade preferences that Cambodia receives, but there's a much bigger picture here. So the ASEAN's Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership has recently been concluded, along with China's the Cambodia-China bilateral FTA, and Cambodia is in the process of negotiating several other free trade agreements. Some of these, such as the Cambodia-Korea FTA, are well advanced, and these trade negotiations, trade agreements, I think, take place within a context of potentially quite profound and long-lasting shifts in regional value chains. We saw, obviously, during the Trump presidency, we've seen the trade tensions between China and the US, and a lot of discussion around how that may change supply chains, production patterns, and procurement, and so on. I think overall there's a sense that this is, we are, also with the pandemic, there's likely to be significant changes. Of course, those changes do create opportunities, and countries like Cambodia can benefit if they have the right policies in place. Finally, the fifth sort of medium-term trend that we identify relates to urbanization and also a growing middle class. I mentioned the 2019 census earlier on, so we're actually working with the National Institute of Statistics to analyze some of the urbanization trends in the intervening period between the 2 censuses. But you can see in this chart as a picture of the Phnom Penh skyline, 2010 and 2019. So you can see some quite visible changes. Within the city, we can also see, again, visible changes in terms of both the growth in the extent of the city and other urban centers, but also very visible changes in consumption patterns, a new and I think growing middle class. Although there are also some questions about whether some of the recent investments will be sustainable in the short term. So with those 5 key trends, we want to just offer a short view on how this relates to some of the key sectors for Cambodia's economy now and looking ahead. I think given the time constraints, it's not possible for us to go into great detail in every area, but we'll just quickly go through a few of the key sectors. In the agriculture sector, I think we see Cambodia already a sort of agricultural transformation already underway and perhaps underappreciated. I mentioned earlier on that agriculture as a sector has not been contributing significantly to growth, and that's true. But what we've seen during that same period is that there's been a gradual movement of workers out of the agriculture sector. And so the value of value added, or the output per worker in the sector, has been increasing. There's also been growing use of mechanization, commercialization. And what we've seen, especially this year and related to both some of the free trade agreements and also foreign investment, is a growth in higher value sort of agribusiness, horticulture, fresh fruit, and other production targeting export markets. We see a lot of potential for increased value added in the agriculture sector, shifting within current production to higher value, and then also changing crops. So this, if we look at certainly the trend of people moving out of the agriculture sector, and then also the greater use of digital technologies and greater integration within the region and regional value chains, we can see these trends playing out in the agriculture sector with good potential for growth. Turning to tourism, of course, the tourism sector has been absolutely smashed by the pandemic. And I think in the introduction, there was some summary statistics on decline in visitor arrivals this year. I think what we've heard from hotels is, occupancy currently is at 5%, if that. Of course, we do expect tourism to rebound, but one of the questions is really around how Cambodia will position itself looking ahead as global travel and tourism recovers. If we look at the headline numbers leading up to the pandemic, the total number of international visitor arrivals has been growing quite steadily. But if you see the chart on the left-hand side, you can see that people who are traveling explicitly for holidays actually declined slightly from 2018 to 2019, while there was quite strong growth in business travel. That coincided with a big increase in the share of visitors from China. And you can see the colored blocks on the right-hand side. China now accounts for, it's the single largest source of visitors, with roughly equivalent to the whole of ASEAN, and much, much larger than Europe and other long-haul destinations. One of the concerns I think related to that is also about sustainability and perhaps dependence on a single market. But looking ahead, if Cambodia can develop the right mix in terms of its offerings and then also the right positioning, if we compare Cambodia's current volume of tourist visitors to some of the neighbors within the region, what we see, looking at the chart on the right-hand side, is potentially plenty of space for growth. And so in that context, it's quite encouraging that certainly with the pandemic has been a huge negative shock. There's a recognition of the need to address that through some short-term actions. And we're aware of the government developing a roadmap for the short-term, the immediate post-pandemic recovery, but then also longer term to look ahead and think about how to develop the various offerings which can be help Cambodia to differentiate itself and then to attract high-value visitors. We've talked a bit about manufacturing and Cambodia's previous or historical profile as a sort of low-cost, low-value manufacturing base. You can see that current profile or historical profile reflected in this chart here, which has Cambodia's exports ranked according to complexity and also size. And so you can see the shading there. Most of the major items being exported are assessed as being relatively lower complexity and lower value. But we do expect this is already changing, and we expect it to continue to change. One of the interesting things within the manufacturing sector is that Cambodia's current skill export mix doesn't seem to be making full use of the skills and human capital available within the country. You can see that in the chart on the left-hand side. So you can see that the skill intensity of exports is shown on the y-axis, and then the human capital quality within the country on the x-axis. So you can see Cambodia, that orange dot, is well below the average, which suggests that the current skill intensity of exports is lower than could be achieved. What we've seen in the last 5 years, and actually it's been continuing despite the pandemic, is growth in higher value exports and higher complexity exports. You can see this on the chart on the right-hand side. So there's a strong growth, essentially each of those circles represents a particular product category. The size of the circle corresponds to the volume of exports. And then the position above the line in the vertical plane corresponds to the rate of growth over the last 5 years, while those further to the right are higher value and higher complexity. So you can see that there's a large number of relatively small circles, small items, which are high complexity and growing. And these are things like bicycles, electronics, vehicle parts, higher value services, also some chemical products. What's been very interesting is that during 2020, despite the pandemic and despite all of the shocks to the global economy, Cambodia's higher value exports have been growing very strongly. And actually, we take a lot of encouragement from that and see very good potential for that to continue in the years ahead. I think the government, we see quite a strong policy commitment on this. That corresponds both to some of the infrastructure and logistics investments that we discussed earlier on, but also on the policy front, looking at, for example, the industrial development policy, also the, development of special economic zones, and skills to support industry and higher value manufacturing. So overall, I think it's quite encouraging, and we see, again, despite the pandemic, we see this year rising numbers of investments in higher value production, things like packaging, things like electronics, mechanical parts, and so on. We'll turn now to the financial sector. So I will invite my colleague Pulong to speak to this. He's our lead on financial sector. So Pulong, over to you. Okay, great.
Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
Let me, thank you. Again, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me in this webinar. So let me continue. Just for background information, as of the end of 2019, the whole Cambodia banking systems consists of 62 banks, and of which 47 are commercial, and with that 30 out of that are foreignly owned. The system has 7 deposit-taking MFI for NDI, 76 non-deposit taking MFI, 245 rural credit operators, and 21 payment service institutions, 1 credit bureau company, and then 6 bank representative office, and almost 3,000 money changers. The commercial bank dominate the financial sectors, and actually it is continued to expand, with its assets rising to 42.2 billion by the end of 2019. And when we look at the bank evolution, the average capital adequacy ratio, the yellow bar, it's actually the rate is at 24%, which is higher than the requirement rate by the regulator, by the central bank at 15%. The asset to GDP keeps expanding, and at the end of 2019, it hit 155% of GDP, while credit to GDP and deposit to GDP seems to line with each other, accounting for about almost 100% of GDP. When we look at the lending, we see that lending so far has concentrated on trade and property-related sectors. We see the wholesale and retail trade is the sort of the sector that has got a lot of lending from the banking sector. And also the real estate, construction, and housing, if we add all up together, does account for a significant part of the lending. However, what we have witnessed here is the manufacturing sector received around and and I think that's needs to more lending in terms of to promote the production and so on. So I think this is something that of our state. This is something probably is of interest to some of you. So I think next slide. Okay, the digital banking is the way forward. We see that the financial performance is stable and reasonable. Actually, the average return on equities for the banking sector is reported at almost 12%. And when we look at the top 10 commercial bank return on equity versus the average return on equity in 2019, it shows clearly that out of the top 10 commercial banks, the ABA, the bottom one, is clearly the leader in terms of performance. And this is due to its strategic investment in the digital banking and also the branch expansion. So, and this is of course linked to ADB financial sector program as well, which we have supported the government in key reform areas, including the preparation of relevant legal and regulations framework to support the sector development. To name a few, I think the consumer protection law, the e-commerce law, and the now the ongoing preparation of the implementing regulation for the true law is actually something that sort of support the digital banking as well as the non-banking sector as well. Next one. Yes. The enabling environment has been further for mobile money and e-payment systems in order to bring banking service to the urban, but not just urban, but also the rural areas and the underserved poor, those areas. By 2019, we see that there were 21 payment service operators. So this chart just to show you the development, the fast development of the e-payment or the mobile payment system in Cambodia, as David has mentioned earlier. Also, the central bank has lately launched in October, actually, the new digital currency and payment system using the blockchain technology. This is the new generation mobile payment and banking called Bako. That's the name given by the central bank. The platform has been participated by 18 banking institutions currently, and I think it will gonna go very fast. The domestic market is at an early stage of development. The Security Exchange Commission of Cambodia was established in 2008, just for background information. The Cambodia Security Exchange was established jointly with the Korea Exchange in 2011. The stock market commenced operation in 2012, and 6 companies have listed. 6 corporate bonds has been listed. So far, by the end of 2019, the total market capitalization account for 2.6% of GDP in 2019, comparing to 1% of GDP in 2016. So I would like to mention that although some corporate bond has been issued, the government bond market does not exist yet. The draft law on government securities is expected to be adopted by the National Assembly before the end of this year, so quite shortly. And that would pave the way for the government bond issuance, likely planned in 2022. The government bond will then create a sort of the risk-free benchmark for pricing the the corporate bond. The insurance sector is growing steadily. When you see in the chart, we include the life premiums, non-life premiums, and also the overall growth rate, which increased, by 31.4% at the end of 2019, as compared to the similar growth rate in 2018 and 25% a bit lower in 2017. So I just to mention, a few key sector in the financial sector in Cambodia. And let me pause here. I think I hand over to David. I think the next one is about ADB programs and the medium-term economic outlook. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Pulong. So I think, the financial sector is another example in some ways of how Cambodia is perhaps unexpectedly, for some people, innovative and making a very good use of technology. Turning now and sort of putting all of this together to the economic outlook. So the first thing is to say that our most recent forecast is for the economy to contract by 4% year on year during 2020, and then to rebound to growth of 5.4% in 2021. The chart on the left-hand side shows you the supply side contributions, or sort of how the different sectors that make up the economy will contribute to the growth performance. What you can see is that the service sector, which is seen to contract significantly during 2020, that's really it's being driven by hotels, restaurants, travel, so service sectors related to tourism. We also see a decline in manufacturing. That's the yellow bar, which is related to, obviously, the impact on the garment sector. So while the higher value manufacturing has been growing strongly this year, it's growing from a small base, and that growth is not sufficient to offset the contraction in garment exports that we've seen, especially in Q2, but also a bit in Q3, comparing to last year. In terms of the rebound, we see construction sector still contributing to growth for now, but we do expect that to slow down in the medium term. We would not expect the sector to continue to grow indefinitely. There's been a lot of, question and comment around the differences between forecasters and the implications of those differences and so on. The chart on the right-hand side of this slide, I think, is very helpful in understanding, in a sense, the significance of the differences, and may help you to think about how meaningful or how important are those differences or not. So let me first just describe what you see in that chart. So there's a diagonal green line, and that represents the actual growth up to 2019, and then the trend before COVID-19. So we've adjusted so that in 2019, the GDP was equal to 100. And what you see there is that with the trend of growth at 6 to 7% per year that we saw prior to COVID-19, if that had continued, then by 2021, GDP would have been close to 115, right, using that rebasing. What we see is that, of course, the economy is contracting in 2020. Different forecasters or different agencies have given slightly different projections. So on the chart, you can see in the colored lines, the government of Cambodia, ADB, the ASEAN Macroeconomic Research Office, AMRO, the World Bank, and also the IMF. And so you can see that each of those forecasters is predicting a similar trend, with a contraction in 2020 and then a recovery in 2021. We can easily get quite sort of fixated on the percentages, but what this chart helps you to see is that irrespective of whether the most optimistic or the most pessimistic forecast, by the end of 2021, the economy will be significantly smaller than it would have been if the pandemic had not happened. And from the sort of downside, the glass half empty view is that's Cambodia missing out on some time there in growth. But on the other side, there's that would tend to suggest the potential for higher growth in terms of growing towards potential. So provided that the key, that any downside risks can be managed, we could easily expect quite strong growth in the medium term. That's consistent with the outlook that the IMF has published in its World Economic Outlook, which extends out to 2025. From ADB, we do not publish such long-term forecasts, but in this chart you can see the most recent IMF forecasts going out to 2025 and covering the countries within the GMS region. So the perspective is for all of them to return to growth. Actually, in showing the GDP in nominal dollar terms, we see Cambodia's GDP increasing more rapidly. But overall, we see a picture of continued convergence for Cambodia. The outlook is not without risks, and there are 6 that we would highlight. The first is that the recovery in tourism and consumer demand that we expect in 2021 may take longer than we've anticipated. There's been very, very good news on vaccines, and I think that's been reflected in market sentiment and also in people's projections about real sector activity, for example, in tourism. But it's uncertain, and recovery in tourism is conditional globally on development of systems to enable travel and to enable certification of travelers and management of health risks. And then at the country level, there will also be a need to put systems in place. So none of that can be assumed. It may take longer than we expect, and as a result, we may see a slower recovery than we had hoped for. The second risk relates to the slowdown or possible slowdown in construction and real estate activity. Obviously, the pandemic has been in some ways a demand shock, and that may transmit into demand for retail space, office space, and also residential and housing, which may actually then impact on growth. We also see risks relating to poverty and inequality within the country. The government is doing a lot through its social protection measures, both in terms of cash transfers, cash for work schemes, support for the workers who've been laid off, and so on. But it is an issue, and depending on how the economic recovery sort of progresses during 2021, this may also be something which drags on demand and creates additional challenges in terms of growth. Related to that is an issue of household indebtedness. This is something which we often read about in the newspapers. It's particularly related to the growth of household lending from the microfinance sector, and some questions about how repayments and restructuring of loans may progress during 2021. Looking ahead a little bit beyond 2021, some sort of more medium-term issues. So one is around the skills shortages and skills gaps. That can relate to the digital economy and use of new technologies, but also in terms of manufacturing, service sector. We may see issues where skills shortages or skills gaps start to become a real drag on growth. And finally, climate change and water resources is very important for the agriculture sector, but also has implications for other sectors. And I think it's very real. We're seeing some issues now, and we may well see more problems coming out of arising from climate change in the future. So not to be too pessimistic. I hope we've tried to I think overall be realistic in balancing, but the outlook is very positive, but there are some risks which will need to be managed and watched carefully. That concludes our presentation. Thank you very much for your time, and of course we'll be happy to answer your questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I see some questions in the chat box. Maybe Tom, I see there's only about 3 or 4. Would you like us to take them, or have you received any other questions as well?
Yes, we've certainly got the questions. And first of all, I'd like to say a very big thank you to Sonia, David, and Poulon for joining us today and sharing your expertise. We do indeed have a few questions, and audience members, thank you for sending them through. If you have any others, now that would be the time to type them in. But I think many of the questions were even addressed were addressed in the presentation itself. But just for the benefit of those who maybe or would like further clarification on those issues, the first question I would like to ask is, related from Prang Sapip and one from Peter Ford. And they raised the point that many of the areas of this presentation, many of the predictions were focused on how past trends were expected to pick up after 2021. So how the tourism sector was going to continue to grow, how the garment sector was going to continue to grow. I guess the question from Peter was, how realistic is it to base these projections on past trends going forward, given just how hard the tourism sector has been hit, and in light of new trends in manufacturing?
Yeah, so perhaps I think I can just make some clarification, and David, then I'll hand over to you. I think by no means I think what we're implying that the past, what's happened in the past is going to continue. I think we have to recognize that the crisis has been, as many crises are, a great opportunity for transformation, and we're seeing the same happening in Cambodia. And I think before we go on to the sectors, I would just like to say that I think one of the things we've seen is the great transformation within government. I mean, they've always had a digital agenda, but I think when the crisis hit, the move towards more digitalization and even the way the culture in the public sector is changing, I think it's been quite transformational. So a lot of Zoom meetings, a lot of document exchanges and dialogues online, and I think the move to making more data available. So that's, I think, been one transformation. And that has not been in the past, but of course we see that going forward. And I think that's what David was trying to capture when we talked about steady reforms. I mean, there are reforms, of course, for the enabling environment, but also between the public service. Also, I think some of the other trends are in infrastructure. So the kind of infrastructure that's going to get built is going to look very, very different, I think, in the future. Of course, we've had rural roads in the past, but now we've talked about the super highways. We're talking about the electronic infrastructure, digital infrastructure. So what's going to look like in the future is also going to be very, very different. We talked about shifts, I think, in the regional value chains and the sort of trade agreements that have been reached. Clearly, that is looking very different. I think from our perspective, we welcome diversification. So I think, that would be our advice and has continued to be our advice to Cambodia, that it really needs to diversify its markets. And of course, we are very much for multilateralism and global value chains, because I think that just helps to diversify and mitigate the risk. I think the last trend, which is again different, what we mentioned in terms of the drivers of our growth was urbanization. Cambodia has predominantly been a rural economy, but the trend towards urbanization will continue as the population becomes educated. And, as you see these growth centers of Sihanoukville, Bavet, Battambang, Poipet, at least in terms of our country's strategy, we are seeing these as modes for growth. So I think, clearly, past is not going to continue. There's going to be some changes going forward. I think there was also a question, Tom, David, I think you partially answered it. When will Cambodia rebound to pre-crisis level? You did allude to it, but maybe you can talk to that. And also, what determines the speed of recovery? And I can supplement. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Sonia. Maybe the first thing to be very clear, our presentation and our projections are absolutely not just based on a resumption of the pre-pandemic trends. We recognize that I think the pandemic is going to be quite a profound sort of turning point in many areas, and it's I think unrealistic to assume that specific trends and so on that were ongoing pre-pandemic will just pick up next year. That's it's unrealistic. At the same time, I think we need to look at the fundamentals and not lose sight of that in our rush to acknowledge that the world has changed. So one key point, we tried to pick this up in the presentation. One clear sort of key point is that despite 25 years of breakneck growth, Cambodia is still, in terms of its level of economic development, GDP per capita, and so on, it's still got plenty of space for catch-up growth, so-called convergence growth, and that's even within its immediate neighborhood, right? And so the integration with neighboring economies, at the same time, the openness to trade and investment with the rest of the world, I think bodes quite well. It creates a lot of opportunities. In terms of some of the specifics, I would say that in the manufacturing sector, the resilience of some components of the sort of garments, footwear, and travel goods in rebounding in the third quarter, if we look at the sort of near-term data. There was, I think, colleagues in EuroCham referenced the latest data on factory closures. If you compare that to the peak of the pandemic in April or May, you'll see that the majority of the factories have reopened. Most of the factory workers are back at work, and actually some segments are seeing product segments are seeing very strong growth. Similarly, in terms of the manufacturing sector as a whole, the strong performance of higher value manufacturing segments, it's encouraging. It's not to take anything for granted, but it is encouraging. In the tourism sector, I think what we tried to communicate is that the headline growth that was in visitor arrivals pre-pandemic, within that, there were actually some interesting trends in terms of changes in source markets and changes in the profile of visitors. If we look at Cambodia versus its near neighbors, there seems to be a lot of untapped potential for growth in tourism. But of course, there's uncertainty about exactly how tourism will resume. I should say that I don't have any doubt that people will travel and will take holidays in the future, and don't doubt it at all. But which countries will be winners and losers in terms of how tourism develops post the pandemic? It's an open question, and how tourist consumer preferences may change, and what countries will need to do to cater to that. So as Sunir said, I think we're generally encouraged by the direction of reforms. And we can see in 2020 specific examples where the government has been quite agile in responding to immediate needs and also opportunities, and that also bodes well within a fluid situation. So I hope that answers the question. Happy to, if it didn't, please follow up and clarify, and then we can add more.
Oh, no, thank you very much. I think that was a very in-depth answer from the two of you. So thank you for this. Potentially as a follow-up question, and one that has popped up, I know I was particularly interested in your presentation to hear that the growth of higher value exports has really increased in Cambodia. And one of the questions we've just had is what the ADB's thoughts are on Cambodia moving more towards a coal-based energy mix. What impacts do you think this may have on it positioning itself towards more diverse exports? I know that there are some people in the audience today, for example, who are concerned of Cambodia's move away from green energy and towards coal. Do you think this could impact at all its shift towards higher value exports?
Okay, I think let me take that question, David. I think first of all, I think from a historical perspective, I think Cambodia's energy sector is pretty intriguing. I think just to give you some perspective, Cambodia started out as a very distributed sector. We had a lot of very, very small independent diesel operators. In a number of countries, we see that, there's a centralized SOE providing energy mostly through coal or hydro. And then we have to sort of come in and help unbundle that sector. But Cambodia started out at the other end. That's one very unique feature of Cambodia. Secondly, I think in the beginning, about 20 years or so ago, Cambodia was importing a lot of energy from Thailand. In fact, one of ADB's first private sector projects was with the private sector, importing and setting up a private sector transmission line from Thailand into Cambodia, and also importing energy from Laos. So I guess at that time, it didn't have that many resources. Then you see a trend towards, many coal-powered plants and hydro plants, which we're all aware of. I would say that, Cambodia is moving back to coal. It certainly has a large share of coal. And we will see some of the, we do see some of the larger economies in the region, China, India, others, which also have a large share of coal. And they are making steady moves. From our perspective, we are, of course, very keen on renewable energy, and we are currently working with the government development plan to try and increase that share. So the reforms are well underway. It does take a while. I think other than government's good intentions, but it also takes a while for the industry to develop, for the technologies to develop, and for the consumers to start demanding clean energy. And the consumers, I mean also the private sector and the shareholders. So I think, I hope that's answered your question, but I think we're seeing, and we're certainly in dialogue for a steady increase in renewable energy. Having said that, I think, we also do outline the risks. So we can build a lot of infrastructure, but that leads to climate catastrophes, whether these be floods, or social problems, that can undo all the good work. For instance, the flooding that we've been having recently, that has really destroyed like the road infrastructure. So I would just highlight that I think, in addition to pushing for reforms in a particular sector, there's some cross-cutting areas that we also talk to governments about, and they're quite well aware of, such as the impact of climate change.
Okay, thank you very much. And David, is there anything you would like to add to that particular question?
No, I think that was clear. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Sunil, thank you very much. So another one of the questions we had, in light of one of the things another statistic I was quite impressed with was Cambodia's percentage of FDI related to GDP. It seems like it's relatively high compared to its ASEAN neighbors. And I know that certainly at EuroCham, we are always quoted the statistic of the World Bank Doing Business Guide score. One question from Brett Elvish. I know this is World Bank, not ADB, but one question from Brett Elvish was, currently Cambodia is ranked 144 out of 190 countries in this. With its ability to attract FDI, with its efforts to promote further investments, how do you see the Cambodian Doing Business score improving? Do you see it improving?
David, do you want to take that and I can supplement?
Sure. I never thought I'd find myself in a position of defending the World Bank, but since they're not here, I guess I have to. I think we need to be clear about what the Doing Business indicators and index measures, the strengths and utility of it, and then also maybe what it's not telling us. I hope. I'm sure many people in the audience are familiar with the distinction between de jure and de facto. So the Doing Business indicators are essentially measuring more what is defined in law and policy, and if things are implemented exactly as prescribed. But what we see is that there's often actually kind of a divergence between the reality that businesses face, and so often there are. Businesses are able to operate in environments which very successfully in environments which are measured according to the World Bank's Doing Business indicators as being, very unfavorable to enterprise. One of the classic examples of this that has been widely cited in the economic literature is the historical scoring of China's business environment in the Doing Business indicators. So for quite some time, China's business enabling environment was rated as being on a par with the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I think anyone who's in the audience could appreciate they couldn't be more different, and they have a very different trajectory and a different profile in terms of how it is to do business. So without wanting to discount the Doing Business indicators completely, I think there is obviously an ongoing effort to address and improve the business enabling environment. I think it's important, and I hope that the government will continue to be open and listen to the concerns of businesses, where they face real problems. But I would say that the volumes of investment that Cambodia has received, and I guess the success in growing exports speaks to a certain facilitation of business activity, which may not be fully captured in the Doing Business indicators. I can also maybe highlight that there are some specific examples of reforms which are now underway, which have not yet been reflected in those indicators. An example would be the business registry reforms that the government has implemented using the new Cambodia Data Exchange. These seem very promising, but they came, I think, just a bit too late to be captured in the latest round of scoring. And then finally, just to say at the same time, you may have seen in the news. If not, if you're interested, you can search for it online. You'll find the stories quite easily. The World Bank itself, I think, has been doing a certain amount of reflection about the doing business indicators and how to make them a better measure of the quality of the business environment in the countries where the assessments are done. So I think, yeah, it's a very useful and informative report, but it has also some limitations. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think I will just supplement with 2 points. I think what we're hearing from the private sector, and I hope this can be confirmed, Tom, from your members. I think one is certainly, I think for SMEs, the ease of registration or the not so easy part to register, and also in terms of tax filing. I think that seems to be an issue. And I think also in terms of logistics, I think bottlenecks on borders, I think, those will have to be undone, I think, really to help, not just with the index, but with the actual, flow of goods and services across borders. So I think that would help. The second point, I think, is on the quality of FDI. So if you look at our charts, in the presentation, you'll see FDI moving away from manufacturing into construction. Now, while that will contribute to GDP growth, I think for sustained growth, one does need to invest in manufacturing ability or higher value services, etc. And that, of course, in turn gets determined by the level of human capital one has. So I think the sustained growth, the quality of FDI will matter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much both for the very in-depth answer to that question. And it certainly helped me learn more about the World Bank indicator, so thank you very much for this. So I'll say that we only have around 3 to 5 minutes left of the Q&A. And so I can see there are some excellent questions in the chat box. Unfortunately, we won't be able to address all of them. One final question that I would like to ask, because I think it is relevant to everybody on board, is related to the recent free trade agreements and also the partial removal of EBA. And so one of the questions I want to ask is, with the recent FTAs already in place and planned, for example, with China, with Korea, the RCEP, as well as the recent partial removal of EBA, what are your own predictions on Cambodia's export profile? Do you think it will shift? And do you expect a change in Cambodia's trading partners as a result of these new FTAs?
So clearly, I think the government has in terms of, I think, diversification, done well in terms of, trying to find as many markets and sign these trade agreements. But in order to access the markets, I think, it will have to, again, become a little more competitive, I think, in terms of the product mix it's offering, and also in terms of attracting, like I said, investment into the country to enable manufacturing. So if you look at Cambodia's trade balance, at the moment, it's, the value of its imports is higher than its exports. So that gives us a bit of a pressure on the current account balance. So I think ideally we would like to see the value of exports, higher, and that will be determined by the kinds of products it's exporting. So just to, I think, give a more simple answer, very good to diversify markets, but to be able to access them, you have to work, I think, on the kinds of products that you will be serving these markets. And I think how also well integrated you are in these value chains. So, for instance, in the garment sector, can you move up in the sort of the products that you are producing? And you will look at the chart that I think David, the bubble chart David had alluded to earlier. So within each industry, you have to move up to more sophisticated products. And at EDB, we are doing a study. I should share with you for both the tourism sector and the garment sector, and hopefully that will be available early next year. So we will do a book launch on looking at the complexity of Cambodia's exports and how what else it needs to do in order to be able to move up and generate more value.
Yeah, maybe just to complement what Sunir said. I mean, we don't have a sort of ready soundbite like, the FTA will add so many percent to GDP or so many $1 billion. At least not yet. Perhaps we will later. But I think we can see the changes in market access. They will have implications, but it will take time for the trading patterns to change. So I think the FTAs with China and the agreement coming in with Korea, perhaps in the near term, one of the most relevant segments in terms of export growth may be in agricultural products. We've seen already some beginnings of, for example, bananas, other tropical fruit, also horticulture products. And these are relatively labor intensive and make, I think, good use of Cambodia's endowments and its possible, we could say, comparative advantage. There's then a broader trend, which is the growth of the intra-regional trade within ASEAN and within Asia Pacific. So, RCEP and then the bilateral FTAs, I think, play into that and to Cambodia's integration within regional value chains, as opposed to maybe the sort of global value chains. But these are trends which will play out over slightly longer time periods. And in the short term, demand from the US and demand from the European Union will continue to be important for merchandise exports because they are the key export markets. On services, on tourism, a lot is going to depend on what happens within Asia Pacific and also especially with China and the neighboring countries in ASEAN, just because they have been accounting for a majority of visitor numbers, and that trend is only going to intensify, I think, over time. Thank you.
Okay, David and Sunir, thank you very much again for addressing those very broad questions in a small time frame. So I really appreciate that and your inputs. So noting the time of 4:11 p.m., I'll draw an end to the Q&A here. I do recognize that there are some excellent questions in the chat box that we have not got to yet. I also thank you, David, for the good point on FTAs. I would encourage everybody to have a quick look at that point. But to close off this particular webinar, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of our participants for joining. Thank you for the excellent questions. But especially I want to thank the members of the ADB team for sharing their insights today. I learned a lot from this. And I know if there are any other questions, you can send them either to the EuroCham info box, and what we'll do is potentially collaborate with the ADB team, and we can post answers to them under the YouTube video. This is one solution that we can address. So I just want to know, David and Sunir, do you have any? Would you like to say any final words?
Thank you, Tom and EuroCham. This has been very, very good for us, I think, also to interact. And I'm really pleased with the questions we were asked. And we'll certainly be happy to answer any more questions. You can visit our website or contact the email. So thank you to all.
Yeah. Just to echo what Sunir said, thank you very much. I feel like we've been doing a lot of the talking today, and hope that we'll have a chance to meet with some of your members, some of the people who are in this session today, and also to be a bit more in listening mode, because we're always keen to learn from others as well, especially private sector. So thank you.
Thanks. And certainly we hope to have some of our larger events on again sometime soon. So again, just to finalize, thank you very much all participants for joining. Thank you very much to the ADP team. Thank you very much to the EuroCham production team for making this happen, my colleague. And I hope to see everybody at the next EuroCham webinar, or at an in-person event in the future if they open up again. So everybody stay safe, and hope to see you at the next webinar. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.